Well, good evening and welcome to St Aidan's for the final session of this year's St Aidan's lectures. The three previous lectures, for anyone who missed them, can be found on the diocesan YouTube page, and also there are links on the St Aidan's Facebook page and website. Those are well worth catching up on, and this evening Dr. James Currall will conclude his series on the environmental crisis in the Church.
Good evening, everybody, and it's lovely to be back here in Glasgow this evening, even though the weather's a bit indifferent. In our first lecture, we discussed the fact that the Western Church has only relatively recently woken up to the reality of the climate crisis and the environmental damage that human beings have wrought in our world. We asked the question, why has the Church been so blind, or at least agnostic, to what for many in the secular world has been glaringly obvious for 3/4 of a century? Partial answer appeared to be that redemption in the writings of Western theologians such as Augustine and Anselm is primarily ethical. Humanity has been viewed as distinct from the natural world, and Christianity and salvation largely concerned with personal and social existence. The Western tradition has therefore relatively little to say about the destiny of the universe, though of course there are a few honourable exceptions. In contrast, we saw that the theology of the Eastern Church has developed a different relationship with the natural world. It has seen redemption as concerned not only with personal and social existence, but also with the physical or natural world. In both Greek and Syrian writing, humanity is at the heart of the natural world. Patristic writing sees salvation more holistically as personal and cosmic, social and universal. And that, of course, raises the question as to whether the Western Church might learn from the more holistic approach to faith and worship in the East. In our second lecture, we took stock of later 20th century developments in recognizing the importance of a wider view of creation across the churches and the history of the season of creation, starting with the formation of the European Christian Environmental Network, urging churches to adopt a time for creation in 1999, the period from the 1st of September to the Feast of St. Francis on the 4th of October, as such a season being endorsed by the European Ecumenical Assembly in 2007, which recommended that the period be dedicated to prayer for the protection of creation and the promotion of sustainable lifestyles that reverse our contribution to climate change. In our third lecture last week, we dug into the current approaches to tackling just one aspect of the environmental crisis, climate change, and asked the perhaps heretical question, are the headline-grabbing approaches adopted by many organisations, such as setting net zero targets to be achieved at some distant future date, really effective, or do they just shift the problem around, making our problem a problem for people in other parts of the world or for our children and grandchildren? And our task this evening is to take stock of what we have learned over the past 3 weeks and think about 3 questions. What does our theology and the Christian faith have to say about the environmental crisis? What does a theologically grounded and realistic Christian response to this crisis look like? And can we, as the body of Christ, provide grounds for hope in a world where many are suffering? These are not, of course, just academic questions, but deeply important ones, because if our theology and our faith has nothing to say to an anxious world, then, to put it bluntly, what is the use of it? In the foreword to the Man and Nature report of a Church of England working group chaired by Hugh Montefiore in 1975, Bishop Michael Ramsey wrote, amidst much practical concern and action about the environment, and much exhortation on behalf of such concern and action, there has been a need for a presentation of the Christian understanding of the matter. Now that was a year or two back. And John Zizioulis wrote more recently, if faith is about ultimate things, about life and death issues, this particular problem certainly falls within that category. Christian theology and the Church can hardly be excused for staying silent for such a long time on this matter. Church and theology must have something constructive to say on a matter like this, otherwise they risk being irrelevant and unable to live up to their own claim to the truth. For a truth that does not offer life is empty of all meaning. It also seems to me that if the Church does not engage our younger people, who are some of the most passionate advocates for the environment, then not only is the Church irrelevant, but it raises a serious question over its future. The Church has to have something useful to say in response to important issues, and few are as important as this one. In earlier lectures, we have agreed that this problem is not primarily a scientific or technical one. It is both a social problem and a problem of justice and fairness. Ecumenical Patriarch Bartholomew has said that environmental issues are intimately connected to and dependent on numerous other social issues of our times, including war and peace, justice and human rights, poverty and unemployment. It is not by chance that the term eco-justice has been used in religious circles to describe this interconnection between creation and creatures, between the world and its inhabitants. We have, in recent years, become increasingly aware of the effects of environmental degradation on people, and especially the poor. But of course, he has also recognized that it is a problem of ethos and a religious and spiritual problem as well. The environment is not only a political or a technological issue, it is, as Bartholomew likes to underline, primarily a religious and spiritual issue. Religion has a key role to play. A spirituality that remains uninvolved with outward creation is uninvolved with the inward mystery too. So, as we start to look at where we go from here, as somebody hinted in the questions last time, don't we have to look at our theology and particularly at the relationships between humanity, nature, and God? This was, of course, the subject of our first lecture. Now, those of you who found the first lecture quite hard going, as it delved into the differences between Western and Eastern understanding of these relationships, might have been forgiven for wondering why such a treatment was required simply to provide a background to what was to follow. And if that was the case, I would agree with you. But of course, it wasn't just background. We have, in this fourth lecture, arrived back there, considering the question, do we need to revise our theology, at least as far as Western Christianity is concerned? As long ago as 1985, in the Gifford Lectures in San Francisco, Jürgen Moltmann said, "It is time for the philosophers and theologians to sit down alongside the scientists and to see what agreement is open to us across the disciplinary boundaries over the content of the natural scheme of things, as the sciences reveal it to us and as it bears on the task of learning. Once again, to embrace the basic cosmological vision that the natural universe is, indeed, a fit home for humanity. Now, there is clearly a problem to be tackled here as we look for a more helpful theological stance than one we have inherited, and I am finding considerable encouragement in the task of revising my theology in the writings of a number of Orthodox writers. For instance, John Zizioulas recognises that the ecological crisis is a crisis of culture. It is a crisis that has to do with the loss of sacrality of nature in our culture. He can see only two ways to overcome this. The first is the way of paganism. And he writes, the pagan regards the world as sacred because it is permeated by divine presence. He therefore respects it to the point of worshipping it explicitly or implicitly and does not do damage to it. But equally, he never worries about its fate. He believes in its eternity. The world is good as it stands and possesses in its nature all that is necessary for its survival. The second way, he suggests, is what he describes as the Christian way. The Christian regards the world as sacred because it stands in dialectical relationship with God. Thus, he respects it without worshipping it, since it has no divine presence in its nature. But he regards the human being as the only possible link between God and creation, a link that can either bring nature to communion with God and thus sanctify it, or ultimately turn it towards man or nature itself and condemn it to the state of a thing, the meaning and purpose of which are exhausted with the satisfaction of man. Of these two ways, it is the second one that attaches to man a heavy responsibility for the fate of creation. The first one sees man as part of the world. The second, by considering man as the only one who would be so deeply respectful of the impersonal world as not simply to preserve it, but to cultivate and embody it in forms of culture which will elevate it to eternal survival. It is now clear that the model of human domination over nature, such as we have in our present-day technological ethos, will no longer do for the survival of God's creation. Now, that seems to me a firm basis for a re-evaluation of our theology. And there are rich resources in Orthodox theological writing for us to draw on. There are also rich resources in our heritage for us to draw on as we seek to reimagine the relationships between God, humanity, and creation. A sacred or religious worldview signifies, as William Blake wrote in no less than 5 of his poems, that everything that lives is holy. Psalm 150 tells us that everything that breathes praises God, and as Gerald Manley Hopkins wrote, everything is charged with the grandeur of God. All creation is a gigantic burning bush, permeated but not consumed by the ineffable and wondrous fire of God's energies. So there you have it. At the beginning of Jesus' ministry, he went to his local synagogue and read from the scroll of the prophet Isaiah and said, "The Spirit of the Lord is upon me, because he has anointed me to bring good news to the poor. He has sent me to proclaim release to the captives and recovery of sight to the blind, to let the oppressed go free, to proclaim the year of the Lord's favour." And whilst Jesus might not have had a whole lot to say about science and technology, he had a great deal to say about social issues and about justice, and he also had much to say about religion and our relationship with God, apparently. Justice and concern for the disadvantaged and the marginalised was at the heart of his work and teaching, as it is indeed in many of the books of the Hebrew Bible and the epistles written to fledgling Christian communities struggling to find their way. The environmental crisis is not simply about carbon budgets or environmental degradation. At its heart, the real problem is about justice. In his writings, the ecumenical patriarch has frequently pointed out the link between environmental destruction and poverty, showing that social justice and ecological justice are linked. And Pope Francis mentions it repeatedly in Laudato Si'. He also warns that some strategies for lowering pollutant gas emissions call for the internationalization of environmental costs, which would risk imposing on countries with fewer resources burdensome commitments to reduce emissions comparable to those of the more industrialized countries, and imposing such measures penalizes those countries most in need of development. A further injustice is perpetrated under the guise of protecting the environment. Here also, the poor end up paying the price. Those that are most affected by these matters are the poor, the disadvantaged, the marginalized, and those who live in less developed parts of the world. These are also, of course, usually the people who have done least to create the problem in the first place. And the environmental crisis makes a double demand on us. Firstly, to recognize the link between our Western overconsumption and the environmental harms that result elsewhere in the world, and the hunger, poverty, and injustice that they produce. And secondly, to formulate a just response, both to what we are doing and also what we and our ancestors have done. The first has been hindered for far too long by reluctance to acknowledge the environmental crisis as a people issue rather than a purely environmental one, particularly in the case of climate change, while the second raises ethical issues that we have barely begun to consider. And it is important that our theology offers a framework in which we can better understand our relationship with both God and the rest of creation, and also recognize the social and political aspects and consequences of the injustice of our behavior. A Christian writer from Syria in the 6th century recounts sharing a meal with a wandering monk and becoming intrigued at how slowly and deliberately the monk was eating. Questioning the visitor later, he was told, "I hope that God will not judge me for having opened my mouth over food which is derived from God's gift, without stretching my thoughts to give praise for his bounty. I hope in his name that I shall not be condemned for having stretched forth my hand to my mouth without every time," and so on. Similarly, stretching forth my tongue to praise and my mind to prayer on behalf of those who labor and sweat and toil to supply my need. Rarely do any of us bear the full environmental costs of production, use, and disposal of the things that we use and consume, and it is mind-blowing to contemplate the web of interdependence in which we live our lives, and our debt and responsibility to others in every mouthful, every action, and every decision. The resources of creation are a free gift from God, and our access to them is not a right. In the monk's explanation, we see both a concern for and prayer for his benefactors, and also an attitude of thankfulness. Gratitude is, I think, central to the Christian faith. Thankfulness is a key feature of our relationship with God. In our first lecture, we looked at the degree to which thankfulness featured in the early liturgies, such as that of St. James of Jerusalem. In those ancient liturgies, the focus is not solely on the consecration of the elements or anamnesis of the cross of Christ, but in the lifting up of the gifts of bread and wine to the Creator, what is called in the ancient Greek liturgies the anaphora, the lifting up. This is of particular significance for a theology of creation. As John Zizioulas writes, it attaches at least equal centrality, if not more, to man's act as the priest of creation, as it does to God's act of sending down the Holy Spirit to transform the offered gifts into the body and blood of Christ. And this forgotten aspect was so central in the consciousness of the early church as to lend itself for identifying and naming the entire Eucharistic service. In the ancient church, the service was called, not without significance, purely and simply anaphora or Eucharistica, both terms having to do with man's priestly action as representative of creation. In the preface at the start of the Eucharistic prayer in the Liturgy of St. James, we find words of thanksgiving for all creation. It is very meet, right, and our bounden duty to praise thee, to bless thee, to worship thee, to glorify thee, to give thanks unto thee, the maker of all creatures visible and invisible, the treasure of all good things, the fountain of life and immortality, the God and governor of the universe, to whom the heaven and the heaven of heavens sing praise with all their hosts, the sun and moon and the whole choir of stars, the earth and sea and all things that are in them. The Eucharistic prayer here summing up our thanksgiving for all God's gifts, beginning with the creation of the world. In our own liturgies, at the offertory, we find all things come from thee, and of thine own do we give thee. Even if the gifts of bread and wine are not simply direct from nature and may represent plant breeding, human skill, knowledge, and technologies, we should acknowledge that all of this belongs only to God. Everything that God gives us is always a trust to be used for the benefit of all God's creatures. Teachings of the Church Fathers against the rich monopolizing of resources to the detriment of the poor have obvious relevance to how we should be responding to the environmental crisis. And does this principle not apply to us as individuals as well as our public authorities and governments and our politicians and leaders? Now, Patriarch Bartholomew has been probably the most outspoken of Christian leaders on the subject of the environmental crisis. Much of what he has said reflects the ascetic ethos that is integral to Orthodox Christian spirituality. Take, for instance, this comment from a reflection on transformation. In learning to give up, we gradually learn to give. In learning to sacrifice, we essentially learn to share. So often our efforts for reconciliation and transformation are hindered by an unwillingness to forego established ways as individuals or as institutions, by a refusal to relinquish either wasteful consumerism or prideful nationalism. A transformed worldview allows us to perceive the lasting impact of our ways on other people, especially the poor, as the sacred image of Christ, as well as on the environment as the silent imprint of God. In a variety of speeches and writings over the last 20 years, the Patriarch and other Orthodox theologians have emphasized the need for repentance and have advocated a solution to environmental problems that lies in the liturgical, Eucharistic, and aesthetic ethos of the Orthodox tradition. In his annual encyclical letter on the Day of Protection of Our Natural Environment on the 1st of September 2006, Patriarch Bartholomew poignantly observed, "Unfortunately, man refused to comply with God's directives regarding the measured use of natural resources according to his needs. Nor did he preserve and protect the world entrusted to him, and thus he estranged himself from the governing grace of God. As a result, man acts towards his surrounding environment in rapacious and destructive ways, as a ruler rather than a steward, disrupting the natural harmony and balance that are from God. Nature, in turn, has reacted to man's abuse in unbalanced ways, inflicting upon humanity a series of natural catastrophes. Recent unusual temperature fluctuations, hurricanes, earthquakes, storms, the pollution of rivers and seas, and numerous other occurrences that hurt both the environment and man are the results of human actions, whether carried out openly or executed in secret. The ultimate cause of all this destructive behaviour is man's egocentrism, an expression of his self-willed alienation from God and his effort to make himself God. It is not for these reasons that ascetic disciplines have been important in most of, and still are in parts of, the Christian tradition. Such practices as self-denial and fasting are important not so much as self-sacrifice, but as an expression of love for the rest of creation, human and non-human. Ascesis is part of learning to tame our self-will and the wants and desires that can take over our lives and lead to frustration when we cannot obtain the instant self-gratification that we desire. In a reflection delivered at the COP26 conference in Glasgow, Elizabeth Theocritoff said, "Probably the most familiar ascetic practice is that of fasting. Once integral to the rhythm of life across the Christian world, this discipline is still prominent in the Orthodox churches. For approximately half the year, we follow a vegan diet with occasional seafood. Given the environmental cost of heavy meat consumption and the divisiveness of calls to abandon meat and dairy products altogether, it is easy to see why this traditional balance of fasting and feasting might attract attention on purely pragmatic grounds, and indeed allowing others a fair share of foods that carry a high environmental cost could be seen as a modern form of almsgiving associated with fasting periods. Nevertheless, the aim of Christian fasting is not to eat lower on the food chain. It is to teach us that even something as basic and intimate as what we eat is not just a matter of personal choice and whim, it is part of a relationship with the Creator and thus with a whole community of his creatures. Such asceticism has far-reaching implications for a time of environmental crisis because it forms persons who are not hostage to their own appetites but have the freedom to act out of self-giving love. Does the present environmental crisis not require us all to make changes in aspects of our lives that we in the developed world have come to take for granted? Limitations imposed by finite natural resources or environmental costs give us a powerful incentive to discipline our wants and to make choices that take account of the needs of others with whom we share God's world. Theocritoff goes on to say, asceticism then has to do with seeking obedience and service in our everyday choices, our use of material things. One of its early fruits is a measure of self-knowledge and humility, a recognition of my weakness and my limitations, my utter dependence on God's grace and mercy, and thus a realization of our shared creaturely frailty. This makes us aware, certainly, of our fellowship with those less fortunate, but also something else very crucial, but less popular, an awareness of fellowship with others who, like us, find change hard, who resent any disruption to the comfortable way of life we have all been led to expect. Humility means recognizing that we are not the righteous, nor in the present case should we expect to be pure of environmentally harmful behaviour at personal or national level. Imperfections, inconsistencies, and falling short are salutary antidotes to self-righteousness, never a reason to stop striving. Asceticism does not transform only the way we use resources, it radically changes our vision of the non-human creation, as we cease to look at other created things through the fog of our own desire to possess, or even of our own needs. This creates a space of wonder and respect that allows each creature to exist in itself and for its creator. The more we see things in relation to God, the less readily we will sacrifice them to serve our own grand plans, even that of mitigating the climate disruption that we have precipitated. The positive outcomes that Theocritos suggests don't, however, result from the application of a set of rules. That isn't the point of ascetic discipline. Asceticism is a personal struggle against temptation, and growing in virtue is not only a personal matter. As Andrew Louth writes, it is a matter of cosmic significance, for such ascetic struggle restores our human capacity of being priest of nature, interpreter of the cosmos. Patriarch Bartholomew speaks of asceticism primarily in terms of self-restraint and reduction of consumption, and importantly, this he links to concern for social justice, and says that it provides a kind of environmental ethics. He also suggests that this need for an ascetic spirit can be summed up in a single key word: sacrifice. This is the missing dimension of our environmental ethos and ecological action. We are all painfully aware of the fundamental obstacle that confronts us in our work for the environment. It is precisely this: how to move from theory to action, from words to deeds. Now, many Orthodox authors see ascetic disciplines as concrete examples of more ecological way of living. Elizabeth Theocritos gives a thorough evaluation of this tradition and its ecological potential in her book, Living in God's Creation. She argues that the ascetic ethos implies, on the one hand, a liberation from destructive desires, and on the other, a discipline of prayer, which opens us to God and the world around us. From all of this, we can see that a reduction in consumption is, in fact, as much a spiritual discipline as anything else. Now, I would suggest that an ascetic ethos is of tremendous practical value in dealing with the environmental crisis, but not only for the obvious reasons. For example, a reduction in consumption. Firstly, it sheds a different light on the sacrifices that are inevitably going to be demanded of the better off individuals and nations in order to address large-scale environmental problems. It is not merely that a simpler life is more fulfilling, as many secular environmental campaigners have suggested, but from a faith perspective, it turns on its head the identification of freedom with consumer choice. The consumer-based demands of our times cease to have the same effect on us and can become a path of spiritual growth. Patriarch Bartholomew speaks of what he calls the missing dimension of sacrifice, which he suggests is primarily a spiritual issue and less of an economic one. In relation to the environmental crisis and ethics, John Zizioulas writes, "Our ecological crisis is due not so much to a wrong ethic as to a bad ethos. It is a cultural problem. In our Western culture, we did everything to desacralize life, to fill our societies with legislators, moralists, and thinkers, and undermined the fact that the human being is also, or rather primarily, a liturgical being, faced from the moment of birth with a world that he or she must treat either as a sacred gift or as raw material for exploitation and use." As the awareness of the environmental crisis has become more widespread, the Church has begun to wake up to its past and present responsibilities, and it is to be hoped that it is gradually accepting that science and technology cannot solve the problem alone. It needs the cooperation of people in their behaviour and particularly in their consumer habits. Not something I've heard a great deal of in synods of the Church. Ethics is the evaluation of behaviour on the basis of what is good or right, or increasingly what makes for happiness. Today, the pursuit of happiness has become an ideal in Western culture. It is even enshrined in the US Constitution, and thus what is desirable has become good. Thus, ethics has been somewhat responsible for our environmental woes. Utilitarianism and the pursuit of happiness have led to the exploitation of the world's resources because it's what makes people happy. So, maybe we need to revise our ethics. As Zizioulas says, we must move from anthropomonistic ethics to a cosmic ethics. Human beings are a part of the natural cosmos and thus have their salvation. Their salvation is part of the salvation of the cosmos. He then asks the question, can human beings be saved without the material world being saved too? 2,000 words, and you have 27 minutes to do it. No. Does our faith not require that we move from a utilitarian to a self-sacrificial ethic? That we move from that long word that I said before, the view that it is only human beings who are of concern to the redeeming purpose of God, human interests are exclusively important, and creation exists only to serve those interests, to a chastened and humbled anthropocentrism, that human beings are of central importance to the divine economy of salvation, but that there is both value and eschatological purpose for the rest of creation, and it doesn't exist simply to satisfy human needs. Romans 8:22-25 might help us in defining such an anthropocentrism, since it depicts creation, humanity, and the spirit as united in hope, and links creation's hope with that of humanity, and specifically that of the children of God. Now, last week we saw that some practical actions that we can take might not have the effect that we anticipate. That is, not necessarily grounds for not taking them, but the more direct the effect, the more control we can have over our contribution to addressing the environmental crisis. In every buying decision that we make, we can, every one of us, do something about injustice. If we ask ourselves the question, have the resources used in producing what we buy been gathered or extracted ethically and responsibly, or has it resulted in environmental harms being done to the localities where people live or work? We will not always be able to get a full or clear answer to that question, but it is more obvious in some cases than others, and simply asking it is quite a change. Every time we buy something that is less expensive than it ought to be, someone else has paid the difference, and rarely is it the retailer or the manufacturer. It is almost always someone in the supply chain, a worker in a factory in the UK or elsewhere, a miner or a grower, often in the less developed world, who have not been paid a fair price for their effort. So again, we should ask the question, who has paid the difference in this particular case? By living a more ascetic lifestyle, every one of us can contribute directly to reducing the share of the resources of God's creation that we sequester for ourselves. By buying fewer things, we reduce the resource extraction, the manufacturing, the distribution, and ultimately the disposal impact that we place on God's creation. In addition, everything that we no longer have a use for that can be used by someone else removes the need for a new one to be made. Charity shops, Swap and Sell, Free Cycle, Gumtree, etc. can all help to reduce overall consumption, and it is something which in every decision can have a direct impact immediately. Every single-use container we refuse, every time we delay replacing something, every temptation that we resist, they all make a difference. Every journey that we don't take or take by public transport, every appliance that we don't switch on or don't leave on standby, every degree that the central heating or hot water is reduced by does make a difference. These actions might seem rather trivial individually, but they add up, and if your friends and family start copying you, it snowballs, then the result could be significant. And the beauty of this individual approach is that we can all do it, and do it differently as suits our situation or circumstances. As citizens, Christian people may feel called to become involved in environmental activism. Organisations that specialise in environmental activism, such as Greenpeace, Friends of the Earth, Extinction Rebellion, others are available, and so forth. Churches may also be involved with specifically Christian organisations such as eco-congregations and Christian climate action. Engaging with the environmental crisis as part of our direct response to God's goodness is not confined to the re-evaluation of our theological and liturgical responses, but activism shouldn't be an excuse for not engaging with the distinctive voice of a faith in Jesus Christ in relation to the injustices of environmental degradation and climate change. The net zero agenda is but only a tiny part of a Christian response and not the sum total of it. The biblical idea of stewardship is about utilizing and managing the resources of God that God provides for the glory of God and the betterment of his creation. We see this clearly in a number of biblical texts. Take, for example, Leviticus 25:23. The land must not be sold permanently, because the land is mine, and you are but aliens and my tenants. Of course, also found in other passages such as Revelation 22:13, Psalm 24:1, Deuteronomy 10:14, Job 41:11, and so on. You can add your own personal favourites to the list. As Christians, we must become better stewards because of Jesus' command to love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your mind. This is the first and greatest commandment, and the second is like it. Love your neighbour as yourself. All the law and the prophets hang on these two commandments. So, as we approach the end of this lecture series, I hope that I have managed to sketch an outline of the distinctive voice that Christian theology and faith can bring to the environmental crisis that our planet faces, but only an outline. That there is a wealth of spiritual resources and theological insights that we can call upon, and that there is far more to it than going electric in transport and heating. In response to the environmental crisis and the injustice inherent in both its causes and effects, it is much easier to make one or two minor lifestyle changes and thereby feel better about it all than to engage with the real problem. And remember, the real problem is a spiritual one. The former is simply a mechanism to greenwash our consciences and is, as we have seen, likely to have little or no effect and may actually do a great deal of harm. What is actually needed is repentance, a turning away from excessive consumption and back to God. Rowan Williams put it very simply when he wrote, "We need to regain a sense that our relationship to the earth is about communion and not consumption. What is needed is nothing short of salvation, and not just a narrow salvation of self, but a salvation of humanity and the whole of God's creation." The enormous challenge we face is described rather neatly by George Newlands when he wrote, "Salvation is a work of love. Where there is salvation, there is love, and perhaps even where there is love, there is salvation. Salvation is an idea, a vision, and at least partly an embodied reality. It encompasses forgiveness and reconciliation, and at the same time, it cannot ignore evil and injustice. It is accomplished through agonizing conflict at many levels, intellectual, physical, political, and spiritual. It relates to specific historical events in the past, to present reality, and to eschatological promise and expectation." If this all seems too vast, too difficult, and rather overwhelming, then the first step should perhaps be to turn to God in prayer, as Christians have done for 2 millennia, in lament for what has happened, what is happening, and what will happen to God's earth, expression of our grief for the state of God's earth as an expression of our love of God, creation, and humanity, expression of remorse for our complicity in what is happening and seek forgiveness, acknowledgement of the injustice of the causes and effects of climate change and other environmental damage, and in the light of these, reflect on all aspects of our lifestyles, and as a result, renew our relationship with God, with humanity, and with the whole of creation. And out of that lament, grieving, and repentance springs hope, so elegantly described by Hannah Malcolm at the conclusion of Words for a Dying World, entitled World Without End. So much of the death around us springs from gainful dishonesty. Dishonesty about the sanctity of each creature, dishonesty about the likely consequences of our actions, and covering up those consequences when they happen. If we cannot bring ourselves to be truthful about our broken histories or the current trauma we face and perpetuate, we cannot begin to heal. Survival, compassion, honesty, these are all good reasons to grieve. But the conviction that Christ's resurrection marked the death of death also contains the hope that our works of love in the present are not consigned to destruction. They participate in a transformed future. Christians have a responsibility not only to take action to contribute less to the problem, but to be prophetic voices in the world. In the words of Walter Brueggemann, they have a threefold prophetic task. The prophetic tasks of the church are to tell the truth in a society that lives in illusion, to grieve in a society that practices denial, and express hope in a society that lives in despair. Thank you very much.